them into the chat box, or you can just raise your hand. Preferably, we would like some engagement, so just raise your hand, and then I'll call upon you when the time's after the presentation, and you can just ask it. And yeah, to give a brief bio to Professor, he's a historian of Africa and Islam. He got his PhD in 2004 from the University of Pennsylvania. He's trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. He's currently a professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also the founder and director of the Initiative for the Study of Race, Religion, and Revolution. His first book, The Walking Quran, which is the topic today, explores the history of thousands of years of Quran schooling in West Africa. He is the author of multiple articles on Muslim anti-slavery movements in Africa and the Atlantic world. And his most recent book, Jihad of the Pen, explores Sufi thought in West Africa. Professor, it's over to you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala barakatuhu. Can I just ask that anybody that's in a position to do so, go ahead and activate your camera. It's always nicer to talk to a room where you can see the people and react in real time as the material is being presented. I also just wanted to give a special note of thanks to UCT's MSA for the invitation, and also to my colleague who I haven't seen in quite some time, Abdul Qadir Tayyib, for helping facilitate this session today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling with just a quick presentation and outline, a sketch of the arguments in my first book, as a way of hopefully leading on to a broader conversation about Islam and about Africa. And again, if you're just joining in, it's always nice. Video is not enabled. Okay. Ahmed, is that something that we can that we can fix so that people can actually be facially present in the room?
Sure, try and sort it out now.
Okay.
We've enabled it now. We initially disabled it, but we've enabled it. So I see Professor Tayyib is now able to show his video. So people should be able to.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Nice to see you, Professor Tayyib. it's been a while, and I will just say, but one other piece as a kind of preface to today's conversation. Very much looking forward to coming back to Cape Town for an actual visit. My one visit to Cape Town was really wonderful and quite pleasant. If I recall correctly, we first met Professor Tayyib when we invited you stateside, but I did make a trip down to Cape Town. My wonderful friend and dear colleague Andrea Brigalia, for a conference that he was organizing. So hopefully this virtual visit can be followed with a real life visit sometime soon. So we'll just go ahead and hop right in, and I'm going to share screen. And I'm not going to rehearse all of the arguments from a book of a few hundred pages with 1,000 footnotes. Let's just cut right to the chase about the stakes of this particular book for African history. So what you see here on your screen are two separate representations, visual representations of how I see the fundamental importance of the arguments in this work. On the
All right, so I think it's on Professor's side, yeah? Yeah.
Scholars of Islam to pay attention to Africa and get scholars of Africa to pay attention to Islam. If you look at this map, one of the things that immediately becomes clear if you sort of zoom out and start picturing the world around it is that Africa is actually the only continent in the world that is known to have a Muslim majority. There are more than 350 million Muslims that live in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is nearly 3 times as many Muslims as live in North Africa. 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in sub-Saharan Africa, and 28%, 27% of the world's Muslims live on the African continent itself. But we often don't think about Islam when we think about Africa, and we often don't think about Africa when we think about Islam. The two things are portrayed as mutually exclusive for reasons that emerge from our colonial historic legacies. But just to give you a few kind of perspective changing figures, there are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt, for example, right? There are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. There is a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. The racial construction of the field of Islamic studies often portrays Africa as irrelevant, or maybe North Africa is allowed to be relevant, but it is cut off from the rest of the African continent, moved into the Arab world, and the Orientalist paradigms that frame the field are unshaken and unmoved. So this is one kind of visual representation of the argument of the book, but another visual representation of that same kind of argument would come from this Turkish miniature from the 16th century, which shows the Bilal, the second adult male to accept the religion of Islam, himself of African descent, standing atop the Kaaba. The book is fundamentally a call to get people to pay attention to the centrality of African figures in Islamic history. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is represented in the cover image. And I'm going to stop the share just to move more quickly through the slides without giving anyone whiplash. And I'll just focus in on the cover so that we can get to the core argument of the book. If those are the core stakes, is recentering Africa in the story of Islam, the core kind of historical and epistemological argument is represented on the cover. And this is one of those cases where a picture really is worth 1,000 words. We have likely heard the hadith reports narrated by Aisha, where she is asked by an interlocutor. It's during the time of the fitna between the Muslims after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And she's asked by an interlocutor that has actually, sort of broken ranks with an enemy camp to come to inquire just about the character of the messenger of God, peace be upon him, with Aisha. And Aisha answers, when asked what was his character like, she asked the man, have you read the Quran? And the man says, yes. And she said, then you already know his character. His character was the Quran. Then in a separate recitation of or a separate narration about the same event, she continues and she says, he was the Quran walking upon the earth. Now, why this particular framing mechanism for this book? Because in my study of the learning and teaching of the Quran, which is the subject of this work, the thing that I kept coming back to over and over again was the centrality of bodily practices in the way that Islam was transmitted historically in West Africa specifically. I'll just show you what I mean. Here are some of the wooden tablets that are still used as the primary means of Quran memorization in West Africa. This is a picture from the 60s. Here's one that I took in 2007. You still see children learning the Quran on alwah, the Arabic plural. Alwa is what they're usually called as a singular in Wolof. With the slate board laid across the knee, learning particular postures and dispositions towards the word as they're learning the word itself inscribed on these tablets. But one of the practices that immediately drew my attention when I began researching the history of Quran schooling in West Africa and the transmission of Islamic religious knowledge there was this, what I thought at the time to be a very curious practice regarding the slate boards, which is that oftentimes after the children had finished memorizing the lessons that were written on those wooden boards, the boards would be washed with water. And then the children would drink the water that came off of the slate board that had the Quran that they were just memorizing. Sometimes children would have a board on their head while they recited their lesson back to their teacher, just to demonstrate that they weren't cheating off of their own tablet in their recitation. And then when they were finished with the recitation, they would then lick the board clean. Bringing the Quran into the body. And this was one of the most frequently attested practices emerging in accounts of Quran schooling in West Africa from the 1500s right down to the present. You could see this taking place. And I'll just be honest about this. When I first went to Senegal and began researching this, more than 2 decades ago, I thought that this was the shirkiest thing that I had ever seen. I thought that this had to be some kind of African fetishization of the Quranic text. Nothing could have seemed more out of place to me in what I thought should be the sort of disciplined transmission of religious knowledge than, frankly, something that looked like a magical or superstitious treatment of the Quranic text. So as I was transforming my PhD dissertation, which was focused on all kinds of embodied practice in the Quran schools, I started researching deeper and deeper back in time to kind of understand the precedents and antecedents for the way that the Quran is taught in these embodied ways in West Africa. And I came across the following hadith narration that's transmitted by a prominent member of the Tabi'un, the generation after the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Ibrahim an-Nakhai, well-known hadith transmitter. In this particular narration, he says that the mark of a man worthy of the name man in the time of the 4 rightly guided caliphs was that you would see them with ink on their lips from licking the revelation off of their tablets. When I looked in the earliest teachers' training manuals that were used in Maliki circles in West Africa and North Africa, those compiled by Muhammad ibn Sahnun, and a later one by a scholar who is a contemporary of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. The scholar in question's name is al-Qabisi, but he was also actually a jurist in the city of Qayrawan in the same time as the author of the more famous Risala. So both of these very, very early authors narrate a whole set of practices that were just like the ones that I was seeing in Quran schools. They said that in their time, the children would take turns bringing water to the school that would be used to wash the tablets, and then that people from the neighborhood would come by and drink from the water. The children would use the water to drink or to bathe with. And this practice, which I had immediately, because of my predispositions towards the way that I thought Islamic knowledge ought to be transmitted, that I had immediately presumed was something that was alien and African somehow, was actually the preservation of an ancient custom which had been abandoned in basically every other part of the Muslim world in its association with Quran schooling, for a simple reason, a number of reasons. The first is that in most parts of the Muslim world, the alwah, the tablets are unknown. And if you are learning Quran from a book, or if you are learning Quran in a modernized state school where you're sitting at a desk and the teacher's at a blackboard, the problem of how you are going to erase your daily lesson does not present itself in the same way. The narrations about why the Quran is ingested when it is erased were just as interesting as the fact that the Quran was ingested when it was erased. There are a series of hadith that talk about not a series of narrations rather that talk about not wanting to leave the wash water that was used to transmit the Quran in places where birds or animals or people might defile it with their waste products. So when the Quran wasn't drunk or bathed with or ingested, it was sometimes a hole was dug underneath the hearth, the glowing fire which the students used to read and study by firelight, and the water was poured under there where no one would ever put their foot on the Quranic text. The idea was that there was a kind of reverence towards the text itself and a kind of intimacy that was being produced through this kind of embodied engagement, which just doesn't happen in the way that we learn now, right? And just think about this particular ritual taking place day after day in these kinds of schools, is that a student over the course of time is going to come to feel themselves as being literally charged with the power of the Quran itself, because one is bringing God's verbatim speech into the body. And God's verbatim speech is, of course, within an Islamic epistemology, literally the substance of which all creation is itself made. إِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونُ. When God wants to decree a matter, he has only to say unto a thing, be, and it is. His speech is the fundamental substance of which creation is made. Therefore, that verbatim speech is the most powerful substance. And the Quranic text was being treated in this way, seen as transforming the body of the one who ingested it or bathed with it through osmosis, through the power of its own agency, which is, of course, a thing that is utterly impossible in Western epistemologies, where this fiction called the mind processes information and then commands a body. In such an understanding, a word cannot take direct action upon the body itself. But when I started to pay close attention to the way in which knowledge was transmitted in Quran schools, a number of, sort of convenient fictions about the way that modern Muslims educate ourselves and the way that modern schools function revealed themselves. The first, and I'll just be blunt about this, we'll go back to that Cartesian formulation that I just, sort of put on the table, the idea that the mind compels the body. One of the interesting, sort of revelations that came from the research surrounding this book is that, in point of fact, the Quran never once uses the term mind, not as a noun. The term aql, which becomes a convenient term of usage for many medieval Muslim theologians, not so much in West Africa, but in other parts of the Muslim world, is a word that does not appear in nominal form in the Quranic text at all. Aqala, intellection or understanding, appears in a verbal form, but the thing that does the intellection in the Quran is not a Greek fiction called the mind, but rather the heart. They have hearts, but they don't reflect with them. They have hearts, but they don't see with them. Hearts and bodies are capable of perception, cognition, knowing, and understanding in the Quran, because there's no mention of this Greek fiction called the mind. The heart is mentioned 132 times in the Quranic text. The sadr or sudur, the breast, which encompasses it and encloses it, is mentioned 44 times. The fu'ad, the ardent flame of the heart, mentioned 16 times. Not a single mention of the aql in a nominal form. So the point of all of this is to say that the epistemology, the approach to knowledge that was embedded in African approaches to transmission of the Quran were very radically different from the ones that obtained in virtually every other modern Muslim society that I had studied. I'm going to go back to the slides to start to wrap up this initial presentation hopefully in a quick fashion, with just a few other things to say about this. And then we'll open up to questions, because obviously we're not going to get through all of the material in the book in a 30-minute presentation. Just want to highlight a few more things. This focus on kind of the practical materiality and embodied practice in knowledge transmission led to a number of kind of radically different understandings of how Islamic knowledge functioned in the past, before European colonization and domination of Muslim society so utterly changed the way in which Muslims come to know things. One of the first things that became clear is, and you actually saw this in this slide, the particular slide. So what you see here is something very, very typical of West African Quran schools. This is from a school where the young man that's seated in the middle is studying from his printed text, which is a text in the advanced Islamic religious sciences, because he is actually a student in this Majlis al-Ilm, this session of advanced study that was run by, God rest his soul, Cherno Modibo Karjalo. This particular school had roughly 2,000 students when I visited it, all of whom were there just to receive traditional ijazahs for text. There is no modern state institution that grants diplomas or respects these teaching licenses in any formal way. Yet, as recently as a decade ago, you could have a couple thousand students come to the tiny little village in the Senegal River Valley from Chad and Cameroon, Nigeria, Gambia, from all over West Africa to still acquire this kind of knowledge. This is just one class. The women are seated off to the side, so they're outside of the frame of this particular picture, but there's about 200 plus students there studying the advanced religious sciences just in this one particular session. And this association between the study of the advanced sciences, those students would then monitor children that were learning the Quran. So there was a close connection between basic Quranic instruction, memorization, embodiment, character training through the discipline of Quran schooling, and a kind of organic connection to the transmission of the Islamic religious sciences. And it was this institution, in point of fact, this pairing of Quran schooling and the transmission of advanced religious knowledge that was responsible for the spread of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa in the first place. It was this institution which built that majority Muslim Africa map that I showed in the very first slides. In chapter 2 of the book, I go into this in quite a bit of detail, but I'm just going to go over it in short fashion now. The military conquests that establish a so-called political caliphate in North Africa in the 7th century and 8th century CE do not reach sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, two things happen. In 652 CE, the conquering armies in Egypt try to go up the Nile to the Christian kingdom of Makuria, a Nubian kingdom in the Upper Nile region, and they receive their only defeat actually in the 1st century of Arab conquest. They leave contemporary accounts that say that Nubian archers can put an arrow in your eye from 300 paces, so we signed a truce. And that truce meant that there was no conquest up the Nile actually until the Crusades from Europe caused Nubians to violate the terms of that peace agreement. And in the 13th century, ultimately, Islam began to spread into what's now Nubia in greater and greater numbers. That's in the East. On the West side, of course, the most powerful imperial states in the world in that time were the gold trading states of West Africa. Africa, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And no Arab army was going to cross the Sahara Desert for 2 months with forces that were strong enough to knock over the most powerful imperial states. Al-Bakri, a Cordoban geographer, when describing the non-Muslim kings of Ghana in the 10th century CE, said that the emperor of Ghana can put 200,000 soldiers in the field, 40,000 of them archers. No armies coming across the desert and messing with that. So what ultimately happens is that it is not the jihad of the sword that spreads Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, but rather it is the jihad of the wooden board. It is actually the adoption of Islam by indigenous families in West Africa, some through marriage with foreign clerics and merchants, but others just indigenous West African families that voluntarily adopt the religion of Islam and begin propagating it to their own communities. Islam is spread in sub-Saharan Africa, not from external teachings from Arabs, but by internal teachings from Africans. And it's not spread through a political conquest that's followed by a subsequent conversion. Rather, it is spread through teaching, preaching, and actually the basic practices of literacy, embodiment, and internalization. The sketch that I just gave you of how the Quran was written over and over again on the insides of African students is literally the story of how Islam gets written onto African history. The production of these clerical lineages, as I call them in chapter 2 of the Walking Quran, is the thing that during the height of the imperial age in West Africa, operating with state patronage and state immunity in Ghana, once the kings, actually even before the kings of Ghana convert to Islam, many of the population have already converted to Islam, and non-Muslim kings foster an environment that is favorable to teaching and to proselytizing. And then under the rule of the most famous of West African emperors, Mansa Musa, often understood to be the wealthiest human being in human history, there is an absolute efflorescence. I'll just show you a couple slides as we wrap up. There's an absolute efflorescence of this kind of schooling throughout West Africa. We'll show you here. And this particular this particular efflorescence, which comes in the 14th century, produces not only architectural structures that are still standing, but sociological ones, right? The clerical lineages that become established in the teaching of the Quran in this period, with names like Sise, Ture, Drame, Jane, these are still the families that are responsible for teaching the Quran throughout broad swaths of West Africa. And they've been followed by clerical lineages amongst many, many other communities. So these, kind of monuments and artifacts to a historical moment when Islam was functioning with state patronage, but without military coercion as its basis, those lay ultimately the foundation and the blueprint for that map of Africa that we now have. I'll end with this last slide, which I want to say, Professor Tayyab, you visited us in Chicago, correct? Can you unmute? Yeah, okay. So at Northwestern University, when I was there, I happened to dig this particular text out of the manuscript library at Northwestern University. This was one that was garnered in northern Nigeria in the 1970s. It's a text by a scholar called Modibo Muhammad al-Kabari. And it is very likely the oldest surviving text that we have written by a West African in any language. This one dates from perhaps the 1390s or the early 1400s. It's called Bustan al-Fawaid wal-Manafia, the grove of gains and good things, or the grove of gains and benefits. And the reason why I have it on the screen now is not just that it's a kind of surviving artifact from that time period, authored by one of those jet black West African scholars, but that the poetic accounts of this particular scholar's life tell you that when he was in the prime of his teaching in the late days of the Empire of Mali, that scholars from as far away as Baghdad traveled to Timbuktu to study with him. There are surviving accounts of Shurafa that left Mecca and Medina to go to Timbuktu to study with what was understood to be the supreme saint and scholar of their age. Scholars from of Sharifian descent left North Africa and composed poetry asking if the like of Modibo Muhammad al-Kabri would ever come into being again. In this time, the African scholarly tradition was a light that literally drew people from all over the world. Kabra, the town from which Modibo Muhammad al-Kabri came, is mentioned in the famous travel account of Ibn Battuta, which I'm sure you guys will have been made to read in some class at some point in time. When Battuta, there's much that he doesn't understand of what he sees when he's in the Empire of Mali. But one of the things that he does mention is that when he passes, he doesn't visit Kabra, but he passes by them. And when he's told where they are, he says, the people of Kabra and Jaga are seekers of knowledge and ancient in Islam. And what he's actually codified there is that he's actually pinpointed the epicenter of this West African scholarly tradition. Those families that I mentioned before, Sise, Toure, Drame, Jane, they are from a collective ethnic / occupational group known as the Jahanke, the people of Jaga, that Ibn Battuta mentioned. And Kabra is this other early clerical center, and many actually of the scholarly families now of northern Nigeria derive their origins from this place of Kabra. In one of those poems praising Modibo Muhammad al-Kabri, they specify that in the city of Timbuktu, before the Songhai occupation in 1470, all of the imams in the great mosque were Sudani, were Black, not of Berber origin. One. And then they go on to say of Modibo Muhammad al-Kabri that al-Kabri, at his Rauda, his mausoleum where he's buried, he said he's buried next to 30 other men with the Nisba al-Kabri, all of them amongst the Salihin, the righteous and the knowing. So the point is that it was this Black scholarly tradition, indigenous, rooted in the teaching of the Quran rather than the wielding of weapons, that transformed sub-Saharan Africa, and that this is actually the relevant model for Muslim proselytizing that we ought to be taking on today. Without spilling, in most cases, so much as a single drop of blood, they transformed Africa from a place that had very few followers of this faith to a place that has predominantly, almost exclusively Muslim societies, stretching from Senegal right through to Somalia. And that's where I'll end today's presentation and gladly take questions.
Thank you, Professor. It's a very insightful presentation. A lot of new information that I've never been exposed to. A lot of things to relearn. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. I see we have a question already from Professor Abdulkader. You can just raise your hand or send a direct message to me or any of the other hosts. Professor Abdulkader, you can go ahead.
So thank you very much. No, I didn't raise my hand. I was just clapping my hands.
Oh, I'll accept the bouquet, but you do have the mic. So if there's anything on your mind, feel free to make a comment, if not a question.
Yes, sure. I will take advantage of that because I was thinking that I might have to stand in line, but thanks. First of all, thank you very much. And it's really great to see you. Obviously, we would have liked to see you in person. But as you said in the beginning, I hope that we can see you soon, as soon as things get a bit better. looking forward for that possibility as such.
Indeed.
So, I mean, we've in my in our research group, reading group, we have last year or so, I think we read through the whole book, Walking Quran. So it was a really great pleasure to read it, and I think that that prompted us to read Zachary Wright. So we had we read his book. So we've sort of, you know, I think with my students, I'm hoping some of my students are there because I told them that you are present tonight as well. So thank you very much for that. For your presentation, and also for sharing. I think for many of the students who are here, probably they would not have, and I would encourage them to read the book. It is in the library, and they should take advantage of that, because the libraries at least are finally open, because last year they also closed up the libraries as well. So one of the questions that maybe if I could use the opportunity to ask you, and I also have to unfortunately go because it's a bit of a, just to get the right time on the crossword. So I was thinking about, in your book, for example, you don't mention anything about, so there are two questions if I could pose it. One is the question of tajdeed. A lot of scholars, place a lot of emphasis on the mujaddids, whether it is, Askia Muhammad, or whether it is, the other mujaddidin from the 18th and 19th century. So do you actually find a sort of a debate and discussion on this question of embodiment, that I think that is very important that you have raised it as such? Because, as we know, in almost all Islamic traditions, whenever there is one position, there's always something else, there's a debate going on. So maybe if you could say something about, whether you have come across any debates on the drinking of the Quran, maybe if I can call it like that. I know you are using the walking Quran, but I think there's some time ago there was also a scholar who was writing about the drinking Quran as such. So I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, Usman Thomas, Sudani scholar, wrote a nice article.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I think that he was probably the first one to actually mention that. Then the second question I have for you is that you make a distinction between, say, modern education, which is, which you call sometimes disembodied, and then, embodied Muslim education, whether it is the Muslim modernist or Muslim so-called modernist or revivalist, or Western education itself. I was wondering whether you can actually call any kind of education, disembodiment, and maybe if you could talk about different kinds of embodiment.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'll start with the second, first. When I reach the conclusion of the work, I actually say exactly this, that there's no such thing as disembodied education, because the means through which human beings access knowledge is their senses. All knowledge transmission is ultimately embodied. And I say that we should look for distinctions in the styles and the way in which things are embodied. But the distinction that I want to make is that Western epistemologies and modernist Muslim ones, which are essentially just post-Enlightenment rationalism in a thobe, okay? That's what they are. That they don't understand that everything needs to take place through the body. They proceed as though one can have access directly to the mind and to understanding. So they disregard the body, they denounce it, they mark it as unimportant, low, base, and irrelevant, whereas all traditional systems of knowledge transmission utilized it. They understood it as the principal vehicle within which knowledge would be embedded. And that shows how utterly false this kind of fictive representation of a mind-body divide is, right? I had my students educate me about this. They said when they read the Walking Quran, and I told them, I said, listen, if you guys don't come in with critiques of this book, I'm marking you down for not doing your reading for the week, right? Like, I need you to engage. We're not here to celebrate, we're here to discuss and debate. And so what one student said is, well, in the end, after finishing the book, I became unpersuaded that this was epistemology at all that you were talking about. I said, please explain. And she said, well, everything that we've been learning in your graduate seminar is leading me to think that epistemology, ontology, and cosmology are just more fictions that the Greeks gave us. Right? that epistemology is about the study of minds and knowing and analysis, and separate from ontology, which is about inanimate bodies, and it reinforces this fake Cartesian divide. Cosmology is everything that's outside of the person, whereas what you're describing in the Islamic tradition is that the microcosm is the macrocosm. The universe is present inside the human being, and none of this is allotted for in these Greek distinctions. So all of that is to say that yes, that every form of knowledge transmission is embodied, but some disavow it. Some will disregard the fact that traditional transmission of knowledge always use the body to transcend the body. Whether we're talking about Shaolin Kung Fu or whether we're talking about Quran schools, it's the same. The body is the thing through which things beyond the body are being accessed. With respect to Tajdeed, and I like the fact that you framed it in terms of renewal rather than, sort of the way that the 1970s historiography would have talked about the West African jihads, which was, sort of the way that things were discussed in that time. My reading of the 18th and 19th century movements is very, very much different from most people. And it's because of the third chapter of the book and the research that I did for the third chapter of the book. The third chapter of the book, which is called the Book in Chains, is about embodiment in the following way. I found dozens of essentially anti-slavery rebellions and revolutions that were galvanized by the enslavement and abuse of clerics, people that were seen as internalizing fully and embodying the Quran. And that over and over again, the violation of such persons was the thing that actually led to the resistance and rebellion movements that ultimately come to be glossed as the jihads. And they later get framed as being something that is about fighting off disbelievers. Whereas in point of fact, if you look at what takes place in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s, or the beginning of Ousmane Dan Fodio's resistance movement at the turn of the 19th century, as it becomes the 19th century, that they are rooted in resistance to the Atlantic slave trade, and especially this flagrant violation by slave trading kings who call themselves Muslims of enslaving integral copies of the Quran and selling them to Europeans. Ousmane Dan Fodio, this jihad that creates the largest territorial state in 19th century Africa. People often talk about it as a jihad against the disbelievers and so forth, but they forget that it begins when 300 of Ousmane Dan Fodio's Quran reciters, people who are all Hafiz al-Quran, are taken captive in a skirmish between his people and the Sultan of Gobir. And instead of being ransomed, they're all sold as slaves. And when that happens, Ousmane Dan Fodio has a dream where Abdul Qadir Jilani, in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad, hands him the sword of truth and gives him permission to take on these people. So there is a very different kind of relationship between those movements for renewal and the one that I think is normally told. I see these as being inextricably tied with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and the way in which Islamic communities serve as one of the registers for that resistance. It's not universal. We know that there are many Muslim clerics that are apologists for slavery. Some trade slaves directly with Europeans and so forth. But one of the stories, I think in many ways, the most important story in the Walking Quran is the one I tell in chapter 3, which is about actually homegrown indigenous African Muslim abolitionist movements that come right out of this epistemology of embodiment.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple more questions. I'm going to take multiple questions at a time, just for the sake of time.
Yeah, and I'll make notes as we go.
All right, so one from Rida Perrin, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's with you being positioned in a Western society, was it difficult for you to contextualize the Islamic epistemologies into a verbatim that could be understood by Western audiences?
Wonderful.
And then, Dayan, do you want to ask your question?
Salam. Yeah, I just wanted to know if there was any continuation of this writing tradition in West Africa after the Atlantic slave trade. Like when the slaves were in America, North America, and South America, is there any evidence that they continued these traditions? Perhaps not full text, because I read there was one person, I think Omar ibn Said, that wrote an autobiography. But apart from that, is there any mention in any documents or actual texts that survived from that time period?
Many. And this is, I have a YouTube video that probably has about 60,000 views where I talked about this at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture at the New York Public Library. We have surviving texts that are written by enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere from the tip of South America all the way up through the US South. Everywhere in between. There are functioning Quran schools in slave barracks in Lima in the 18 teens. There are partial copies of the Quran and legal texts that are written in Trinidad and Jamaica and the French Antilles, everywhere. And that's also one of the arguments that I make in the book, is that ultimately, one of the most salient historical vindications of the wisdom of inscribing the text in people rather than keeping it in books is that you can be stripped naked, put in the hold of a slave ship, and sent thousands of miles away from everything that you have ever known. But your knowledge cannot be taken from you if you have become the book. And that's why so many of these African men and women, in point of fact, were able to reproduce portions of Quran or portions of legal texts. In fact, I can put one on the screen just really quickly in response. In a longer version of this slideshow, I would put this up, but I'll just show you as the answer to the question, and then I'll go on to the other question about the West. This is a text. It's usually called the Ben Ali diary or the diary of Bilal. It's not a diary at all. It's an attempt to rewrite from memory the Risala of Qayrawani. I think I mentioned Qayrawani, Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, the Maliki jurist, earlier in the talk. This was an effort by a man who had not finished his advanced religious sciences training. He was enslaved around the age of 13 or 14, I believe. And so he sometimes transposes scenes for sheens and has other kind of transcription mistakes, but he's writing it when he's in his 60s from memory. And I think that what he's trying to do is actually leave a document that will instruct his descendants about the basics of prayer and ablution. And it works because pictured next to it on the screen is accounts from 1930s interviews with the last generation to have lived as children under slavery before the US Civil War in 1865, where they account about these same Bilali. They used to say that Bilali and his wife Phoebe pray on the bead. They was very particular about the time they pray and very regular about the hour. When the sun come up, when it's straight overhead, and when it's set, that's the time they pray. They bow to the sun and have a little mat to kneel on. The beads is on a long string. Bilali, he pull a bead and he say, Bilambi Hakabara Muhammadu. Phoebe, she say, Amin. So even amongst people who no longer practiced Islam as a coherent system of religious meaning, there was within living memory in the 1930s, the practice of their Islamic ancestors who had in some cases left written texts behind. So this is, and also, and I'll just mention this because my colleague Falun Gong at Boston University would reprimand me if I didn't, is that there are literally hundreds of these texts that have not been studied or have been misclassified, sometimes as indecipherable Arabic, not because they contain transcription mistakes like seen for sheen as we saw in the previous document, but because they were never in Arabic at all. because they were written in African languages using the Arabic script. So we have surviving texts that are written in Mandingo, Fula, Wolof, dozens of African languages using the Arabic script that are recovered in different New World societies. And still very little systematic analysis has been made of them. I'll go to the question because I can see it in the chat. With me being positioned in a Western society, was it difficult to contextualize Islamic epistemologies into a verbatim that could be understood by Western audiences? Well, let me just say this in this way. If you haven't read the Walking Quran, read the Walking Quran. And that's not an advertisement because it's a university press book. I don't make any money from that book. The university presses own the rights to the work. I get like 40 cents a book. I'm telling you to read the book because what's different about this book is that I'm not translating the way that an African Islamic epistemology works so that Westerners can understand it. That's what most anthropology or history does in non-Western societies. I take on an epistemology of embodiment as my methodology in the book. So I don't write about an African Islamic approach to knowing, I write from within one. So I tell a history from inside the epistemology of embodiment. And that's what allowed me to perceive these things that were hiding in plain sight, like the association of anti-slavery resistance with Muslim scholars, because you have to be seeing people as books before you understand the enslavement of clerics as being akin to the desecration of the Quran itself. So I don't explain how the thought process works. I put it on and write a history from inside it. Somebody put in the chat, and I'll just mention this, such a fascinating parallel between the text shared by Dr. Ware and the history of Afrikaans written in the Arabic script. Yeah, of course. And as we know, right, the first time that Afrikaans is ever written, and actually this is the conference that I came to, it was the Arts and Crafts of Literacy in Sub-Saharan Africa, organized by my friend and colleague, Andrea Bergalia. The first time that Afrikaans is written as Afrikaans, as a language distinct from Dutch, it's written by enslaved Muslims at the Cape who are trying to transmit the Quran in a vernacular language. And I'll tell you just one other story because it's related, is I came across a document when I was in the archives in Savannah, Georgia, that was one of the most fascinating things that I had ever seen. It was a text that an early 20th century anthropologist was trying to decipher that was left by one of these enslaved Africans, and he couldn't read it even though he read Arabic. And so it did occur to him that maybe it wasn't Arabic. So he actually tracked down surviving people who understood the Mandingo language, and they also couldn't make sense of it, okay? Then he had his research assistant just read the text aloud phonetically. And that's when they realized what it was. Because the way that it read was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. What it was the Arabic alphabet being used to write vernacular Black English. And it wasn't the Quran, it was the first words of the Bible so it was the book of Genesis written out in Black English in the Arabic script by a literate Muslim African. Mind-blowing.
Aslam, do you ask a question?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Ware, for a wonderful lecture and for a wonderful book. I was part of the reading group with Professor Tayyab, and I must say that the book generated a lot of discussion, has given us much to think about.
Everyone will find something to disagree with in that book. If you don't, then I have not done my job.
Well, what grasped me and what relates to the kind of research I'm doing is the whole issue of embodiment. And obviously, this is something that we've been seized with after reading your book and reading Zachary's work as well. I think what interests me is I want to go back to the hadith that is narrated by Sayyidatuna Aisha, when she says of the Prophet ﷺ, "Kana khuluqu al-Quran,"
Mhm.
that his character was that of the Quran. What is clearly, what comes clearly through from this hadith is that obviously the Prophet becomes an embodiment of a Quranic morality.
Yes.
Now, the embodiment that you speak of in some detail is more akin to a form of tabarruk, in which, you know, the student imbibes the Quran physically. And the word you used in your lecture is osmosis. So, I mean, the kind of questions that rise out of this, and, you know, is essentially an understanding of what is meant by inscription, what is meant by embodiment. What I'm interested in is that in non-Arabic cultures like ours in South Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, and in many parts of Africa, the Quran is memorized by non-Arabic speakers. And some of them go on, they become Hafiz al-Quran and perhaps never learn Arabic in their lifetimes. Some of them go on to study Arabic and learn it. Some people will not learn Arabic, but they'll study the Islamic sciences and become au fait in Islamic teachings and in Islamic ethics, Islamic morality. But in these cases, and this is what I'm interested in, and this is what I perhaps want to hear your response to, is there is a certain distance between this Quranic morality that is manifested in its teachings and its practices, in what's advocated, in the Prophet being an embodiment of a Quran morality, and the kind of embodiment that is, you know, a physical manifestation of barakah. So I'm just wondering, you know, what's on that?
It's a wonderful suite of questions. So yes, his character was the Quran is about a kind of embodiment of Quranic morality, but of course in the other narration, كان القرآن أن يمشي في الأرض. He was the Quran walking upon the earth. And he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, you have made, to God, he said, you have made my khalq beautiful, make my khuluq beautiful. That the point of this is, and really the point of the exercise in its totality, is that this is an artificial divide and a distinction between the ethics and the embodiment. It is one that is produced by that Western approach to knowledge and knowing that separates and creates an analytical, ethical, discursive space, and a separate one that is about being and bodies. This is literally about the inscription of text on people, so that in the Hadith of Gabriel, the prophet, peace be upon him, is sitting knee to knee with Gabriel, that there's a physical transmission. In the Hadith about the first revelations, he's squeezed before he can recite, that there is some kind of special relationship with the physical form of the human being as an embodiment of ethical potentiality, spiritual potential, and knowing, right? What does it mean when God says in the Quran that he creates everything through speech, right? As I mentioned before, when he has when he wants to decree a matter, he has only to say unto a thing, be, and it is. But that's not how the human being is made in the Quran. In Surah Al-Sad, God says, why did you not bow to that which I made with my two hands? The human being is molded with God's caress out of the dirt of the earth. Then the ruh, in two separate ayahs, when I have breathed of my spirit into him, then fall down before him prostrate. So the human being is created with a caress and animated with a kiss. There is a physical intimacy between the metaphysical essence of the divine presence and the physical form of the human being. The human being is made according to the best of forms, or in the Hadith narrations, literally in God's image. So the point of all of this is to say that that separation is one that we've made up. It's one that corresponds to the way that jurists in medieval Islamic empires come to become functionaries and bureaucrats. It's one that marks the intrusion of the Greek philosophical tradition into the way that Muslims process information, because they write as though the aql is a real thing. Show me where. Would he not know, he who created it? If human beings had a mind, God would have mentioned it in the Quran. So all of these separations are proceeding from logics that come from outside of the text itself and the tradition. And what I'm always trying to do is root all of my analysis in first order categories that emerge from the intellectual organization of the Quran itself first and foremost, and then in a secondary fashion, the tradition itself. And so and also I'm a contrarian by nature. so that's going to lead me, to make these arguments that the ordinary ways in which we think about things are actually bearing the mark of imperialism over and over and over again. And we really need to take a kind of radically decolonial reading of it.
Thank you, Professor. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take any more questions. We are out of time. We would love to have Professor again, hopefully in person, very soon in Cape Town, to have him expand on the book. Only so much you can get through in an hour. But yeah, thank you again, Professor, for your time. And also thank you, I see he's left now, to Professor Abdul Teo, who helped a lot with facilitating this discussion and helped us get Professor here. We're going to have another session at 8 o'clock. We're going to have a discussion or a presentation by Sheikh Zaid on science and Islam. And this entire week we'll be having talks for Islam Week at the UCT MSA. So join us for the rest of the week. I think that's it. I'll end the meeting now. Professor, do you want to end up or anything? Oh.
I was just gonna to tell people I can't wait to come back down and visit you guys. I post all kinds of sort of little Islamic reminders from the African tradition on my Instagram, regularly. Be happy to continue to kind of answer questions in DMs if people didn't get the chance to get their questions asked during the live session. So thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure. And I look forward to coming to visit again soon.
Thank you very much.
Somebody mentioned that we need a session on the album. Yeah, it's true. A little known fact. Also, music producer. So we need a session on Islamic hip hop for sure. So we can definitely do that. Take care, guys.
All right, thank you very much. I see you guys.